All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I'm going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015 6th edition. We're in the middle of Chapter 13, How to Use SQL Data Sources. And we're up to page 462, which is on how to use the data source or data list control. A data list control displays items from a repeating data source like a table. So there's a simple data list that's shown on the screen here. It's got two columns of data. One column is I believe the name, and the other column is the price. All right, so when you want to create a list like this, you use the data source ID property of the data list control to bind the control of a data source. Then you define one or more templates within the control that define the content and format of the list. I will tell you, when we're going over this stuff, in many ways, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, this stuff seems, for lack of better words, very dry. All right? It doesn't make a lot of sense until you're actually doing it. My plan is to finish up these 25 chapters, and I hope to do that by the end of next week, and be done with that. Then I want to go back and I want to rebuild the website that I've been creating for the AWD1111 class, this St. Louis Blues, what I call the Blues Line website, and I want to build that, and it'll have 4 pages on it: a home page, it'll have an about page, a contact page, like kind of like what we get when we do our default project, and then it'll also have a store page where we'll have an electronic store. So I hope to be able to show you a lot of this stuff as we go on. Now, will I show you everything? Of course not. There's just not going to be the time. I'm not that good. Maybe you're that good that you could do that, but I'm not that good. So the ASPX code that's used to build the data list is shown below the data list. All right. You'll notice there's the eval in there that we'll talk about in just a minute. Also, we're telling it to take the unit price and put it in currency format. So again, to define the information you want to display in a data list, you create one or more templates. Visual Studio does provide a designer interface that we'll see in just a minute. To display the data from a column, you add a control to the template and then bind that control. All right. You can use the data list for edit operations as well as display operations. But you're more likely to use a grid view, which we talk about in the next chapter, details view, form view, or list view, which we'll talk about in future chapters to do this. So the data list control is kind of a down and dirty little control that you can use to do different things. The basic properties of the data list control, the first two we know very well. Remember that all ASP.NET server-side controls must have their own unique ID and must have run at equal server. The data source ID is the ID of the data source to bind the data list to. So when you create it, you'd get something that looks like this. This is one of those templates. This figure shows how to define the template for a data list. It also shows the one that you're most likely to use. The header is the actual information that gets displayed. So that's, there is no, I'm sorry. The item is the actual information, so that's this. The header, if you want to use it, is whatever heading we'd put up here. You'll notice that it's the item because that's the data that gets bound to the data source. So the only template that's required is the item template. That defines how each item in the data source is displayed. You may need to use a header template or a footer template as well. If the data list contains 2 or more columns, like it does here, with both the product name and the unit price, you can place the text and the controls in each template within a table. That way you can set the width of each column, and you can, in other words, you can do some formatting on it. If you're using Bootstrap, you don't have to place the columns of each template in a table. Rather, you can assign the Bootstrap CSS column class to the text or control, and that's later on in the chapter they talk about this. These templates allow you to define the content, not so much the appearance. To format them, you must use styles, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Now, the common templates that you use for this are a header, which we already looked at. That's displayed before the first item in the database. The footer, which is displayed after the last item in the database. The item template, which we saw, which has all the data in it. You can have an alternating item template to do zebra striping, but if you're using Bootstrap, you don't need to do that. You can just basically set the table to striped, and a separator template, which is just something you might want to display between items. Now, when you come in here and you want to format, this is what you use. So this, and it's shown on 466 and 467 in the book, this is the format page of the properties dialog box. So you can come in here and notice what you can set. The foreground color, which is your text color, the background color, the font you want to use, the name and the size, anything special like bolding, italicizing, etc., and horizontal and vertical alignment. So, to format a data list, you can use one of the techniques shown here in this figure. If you're using Bootstrap, the best way to format the data list is to use the CSS classes for working with tables. As I mentioned, you'd use the tables class and table striped as an example. But another way to format it is to use this format page of the property dialog box. And it lets you set all the stuff we just mentioned. The styles that you're most likely to work with are what? Well, header style, footer style, item style, alternating item style, etc. And those are the ones that you'd specify in here. All right, let's jump into pages 468 and 469, how to use data binding. Once you've configured a data source control, you can bind it to a web form control to automatically display the data retrieved by the data source, on the page. So what they're showing you right here in the data source connection wizard for binding a drop-down list, you use the 3 properties that are in the table here. What do you have there? Well, the data source ID, the data text field, which is the name of the data source field that's displayed in the list, and the data value field. All right, so this, if you remember earlier, this was the name we were showing, costumes or special effects, but this was the actual field we were using. Remember, we were binding together the categories and products table, and the field they had in common was category ID. Now you can bind any control that inherits the list control class to a data source, including a list box, a drop-down list, a checkbox list, and a radio button list. You use the data source connection wizard, which is what we see here, to select the data source, the data field to display in the list, and the value to return. You can also use the data text format string to format it if you want to do that. So these properties that are shown right here are the ones we just mentioned. The ID, the name of the data source field that should be displayed in the list, and the name of the value that should be returned. So again, data source, this, as you saw here, was the long name, and this was the category ID. Once you set all that, here's the associated ASPX code that you see. Now, what is shown here, and this is 470 and 471 in the book, is how you can bind the controls in a template to controls of a data source. You can use this with any control that uses templates and specifies a data source. We'll talk about this in additional chapters as well. So to bind a control to a column of the data source, you use the data bindings dialog box, and that's what you see on your screen here. From here, you select the field binding option, okay? And then you select the fields you want to bind from the first drop-down list. By default, you bind the text property of a control so the bound data is displayed in a control. But you might want to bind another property. Okay. As you make selections in this dialog box, Visual Studio will generate code, like the eval that you see right here. That contains the data binding expression that's used to actually bind the control. If you don't like the ones that are provided for you, you can create your own custom binding expressions. There is an eval method which provides only for displaying bound data. There's also a bind method that you can use for displaying and for updating data. That's known as two-way binding. We'll look at that in the next chapter. All right, the chapter, I believe, maybe I'm wrong here, and I guess I am, pretty much ends with this product list application. This is the one that we've been looking at. All right, so the author says, now that you understand the basic techniques for creating and working with SQL data sources and bound controls, you're ready to see a product list application that uses them. Now again, this is not easy stuff. For this to really make sense to you, you will have to also read the chapter. So this is a simple one-page app that demonstrates 2 SQL data sources, actually 3 because I added another one. The drop-down list on the top of the page is bound to an SQL data source that gets the categories for the products that the company offers. Then when you select a category, the products from there are retrieved from the second data source, which is bound to a data list control that's below the drop-down list. So that's one data source, and that's the other data source. This application relies entirely on data binding that's done in the Web Forms Designers. So in other words, there is no code that we have to write. Okay? As we go on, we'll talk about why you might want to validate certain things. And when you want to do that, or check for concurrency, you'll have to add a little bit of code. So this is the ASPX file on 474, 475, 476, and 477. The first control that we see right there, again, is the drop-down list that's bound to the first SQL data control, SQL data source 1. The auto postback property is set to true in here, What that means is anytime we choose a new category, we want that posted back to the server. The second control uses the select statement that we see down here, all right, to get that category and all the other good stuff to get our required data. All right, but again, the only thing that we're showing in that drop-down list is just, all right, the only thing that we're showing in there is just the long name. That's our data text field. The third control that we have in here is that second, well, we have here SQL data source 1. There's SQL data source 2. And SQL data source 2 is going to be bound to that data list control. Now, we're using Bootstrap here, so we can use Bootstrap CSS classes for tables to format, so you'll see very little formatting on here. And the binding is being done in here via the eval. This is not a two-way binding. And the associated select statement with our second data source is here. So the first data source is bringing in for us the information in the drop-down list. It's bringing in this. The second data source is saying, based on this, basically join together the categories table and the product table and give us the product ID, product name, product unit price, and on hand based on the category that we choose up here. Now, I don't know if that totally made sense. Hopefully it did. All right. Now, the good news is most of the stuff here and the advanced features I've already talked about with you. All right. I didn't exactly, I guess, do this in order, which is fine. So you already saw this, that when you check the generate, insert, update, and deletes, you already saw that if you don't have the, as one of your things in here, if you don't have the primary key, that this will be grayed out. And if you check this, you can add concurrency control if you want to. That's what they're mentioning. Now, when you do this, again, you can come into these statements, be it the select statement or the insert or the update or the delete. None of them, any one, any two, or all three of them, you can do that and you can change what's in there. So if you didn't want it set, maybe if you click delete, you want everything deleted. So you could just change that to delete from categories. You probably wouldn't want to do that, but again, you could if you wanted to. All right. The last thing that's mentioned in the chapter on pages 480 and 481 is they talk about in there how to change the data source mode. By default, the data source mode is set to data set. And what that means is you can look at data and you can change data depending on how you've got that set up. But if you set it to data reader, that's a read-only type of thing. In fact, a data reader is referred to typically as a fire hose. Where you can imagine water coming out of a hose. You can't, once water's coming out, you can't grab that water and put it back in. So if I use a data reader and I'm telling it to show a record at a time, and I've looked at records 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 out of 10 records, I can look at records 6 through 10, so I can go on and look at the rest, but I can't go backwards. All right. The last thing that's discussed in here is caching. And cache is basically, again, allows you to save data retrieved by a data source into cache memory of a server. That way, when it's retrieved again, instead of having to get it again from the database, it gets it from the cache, which reduces database access and improves the performance. That's the good news. The bad news is you've got to make sure that the data hasn't changed. So the cache time that you use typically is going to be fairly short. As you can imagine, a place like Amazon, it would be very, very short. So enable caching is a Boolean value that indicates whether caching is enabled, which by default is false, or disabled. The cache duration is the time in seconds that the cache data should be saved in cache storage. Again, that will differ depending on the size of your company or whatever. Cache expiration policy. If this is set to absolute, the cache duration timer is started the first time the data is retrieved and not reset to 0 until the time has expired. If it's set to sliding, it's reset to 0 each time the data is retrieved. The default is absolute. And finally, cache key dependency, which is a string that provides a key value associated with the cache data. If you provide a key for the cache data, you can use the key value to programmatically expire the cache data at any time. Now that's it for this chapter. All right, so in this chapter, again, there's another example. Here we've got the state, and there we're getting the information on our customers based on the state. So here we talked about control parameters. We talked about the SQL data source. We talked about the data list control, about the eval and the bind methods, the additional code that's generated for you. We talked about the data source mode, which is set to dataset by default, and how you can reset it to data reader. And we talked about why you might want to store information in cache, again, to improve system performance. In the next chapter, in Chapter 14, all right, in Chapter 14, we will be going over how to use the grid view control, which is looks very, in some ways, similar to what you'd see in a spreadsheet. All right, so I will be back to discuss that in just a couple.